where Mather Economics and News Media Alliance will provide an overview and demonstration on digital audience and advertising benchmarks. As you review the agenda, I'd like to mention a few housekeeping items before we get started. First, your active participation is important throughout the session. During the presentation, we'll be managing the chat functionality, so please enter your questions and comments in the question box throughout the presentation. We'll then read these aloud in the order in which they're received. Secondly, a copy of the slide deck and the recording will be emailed to everybody that registered. And as a reminder, we are recording this presentation. And with that, let's go ahead and begin with the introductions. First, I'd like to introduce Arvid. He is the Director of Product Development at Mather Economics and developed the Listener tool. And Michael Maloon is the Vice President of Innovation for News Media Alliance. And with that, Michael will provide some background on the need for this product. So I'll turn it over to Michael.
Thanks, Sean. At the top of us working with Mather on this project as a whole, we identified a need to get more insight on the digital transformation within the publishing industry. And to that hand, there wasn't a method in existence that allowed folks to compare key digital metrics and performance across platforms and publishers. Meaning folks on the front lines with any organization literally would have to pick up the phone or send emails to folks to try and get competitive data and analytics in order to see how they were performing. To that regard, our partnership with Mather made perfect sense, being that Mather is very close to the industry, works with a lot of our members, additionally folks that aren't members, and has a really solid understanding of performance and data, and it made it a natural fit for us to work with them on development of the Metrics Exchange platform.
Yeah, so this is Arvid. So a key component of the platform or the benchmarking tool is really getting a really robust data set put together. I know that often the challenges are different publishers use versions of Google Analytics, or they're using Adobe or something else. There's a myriad ad networks and things like that. So essentially for us, a key sort of gap that we tried to fill was again creating this sort of holistic and standard data set across the industry. That's where Listener came in. It was really designed for the publishing industry. It's essentially a tracking tool, very similar to Google or Omniture. Things that are unique about it is it actually lives, in addition to being on the page, there is integrations with DFP and Rubicon and several other ad networks. There's integrations with paywall systems, e-editions, and even kind of user authentication. So we have kind of this universal tag really built for publishers that connects all these things together. And on top of this data, besides benchmarking, there's things, kind of things you can do with advertising analysis, audience analytics, and even content and newsroom analytics.
Arvid, can you explain a little bit more about the tags? Are they heavy? Will they slow down? Will they slow down participant sites?
Yeah. Yeah, we actually get that question a lot. That's probably the first question I always get whenever I start talking about this stuff. We've spent a lot of time actually addressing that question directly with the way we've designed the tags. So they're very lightweight. In our testing, live testing across multiple sites, we see it's about less than 1% of the actual page weight of a given site. Typically, it's, and again, it's asynchronous. It's, it usually loads last. You can put the script anywhere on the page, header, footer. In a tag manager, you can even prioritize the load order so you're not, messing up anything else. We have found in most of our testing, it's usually the ad stack that takes the bulk of the weight. So it's usually kind of the ad stack is probably 80%, and it's 10-50% the actual content, and then probably 5% or so is just other, tracking other things. But that question, yeah, it's very light, and installation is pretty easy, which I'll actually walk through in a bit of detail later on.
Right.
So with that, we can go ahead and move into just a quick overview. And I don't know, Michael, do you want to maybe give a quick summary, and I might get kind of more into the weeds of what we're about to look at?
Sure. So Metrics Exchange is the Alliance and with Mather's assistance in development, a digital benchmarking tool which allows us to compare revenue, audience, and some custom analytics against peers. So what that allows you to do is say publishers of a similar size or in a specific region of the country or area, you allow yourself to see your analytics and performance against those peers. Note that, and as you can see on the slide, peer data is displayed anonymously, so you won't know who those peers are, but you can have confidence that the cohort is of similar size in comparison, so you get apples to apples comparison. Again, on the feature set, we're talking about consistently defined metrics. Again, reiterating Arvid's point on the lightweight tags. It's very easy to deploy, meaning there's a very simple tag manager set up that you can access through your Alliance login. At that level, you'll also be able to control access to whom has viewer rights to the data. So if you're a larger corporate client and you have multiple properties, you can control who has access at the top level all the way down to the property level. And at the top level, I want to reiterate to all of our Alliance members, this is a platform that is of no additional cost to you. Stepping through the metrics that are currently provided, you're going to see advertising performance, audience, user behavior, a number of calculated metrics and ratios, as well as a series of base dimensions. And again, all of these metrics are things that you can compare against a peer set.
Very good. So without kind of further delay, let's get right into the demo. So I'm going to move my screen over here. And just a quick note here, this is, I think what will be available in short order, if not already there, is I think our link from the NMA website to this tool. But either way, nma.mataeconomics.com is the tool. And I'll talk a bit more about onboarding at the end of this call as well. I'll go ahead and log in with my ID here. I am using a demo account, so it's not really, it's kind of a composite of several publishers' data. So as you log in, you'll see a few things. You'll see kind of a quick intro from Michael and from Metrics Exchange. Kind of summarizes some of the key things we talked about. But we have really three primary things that we'll kind of go over today. We'll start with digital advertising and walk through some of the metrics, data points that we see there. We'll go a little bit into audience and then some of the analytics as well, which is kind of our value add, sort of kind of Mather proprietary engagement data that we're kind of giving to NMA as part of this engagement. So with that, let's go ahead and start with advertising. So here again, we're going to look at essentially impressions, CPMs, and some ad blocking metrics as well. So the first thing you'll note is kind of some of the filters up here. So at the top, you'll see my publication. So as Michael pointed out, if you're a corporate publisher, for example, if you're Gannett and you have 110 newspaper websites that you're managing, you'll see all 110 of them in this dropdown and be able to drill down and look at those. The time range right now, we're since this is just launched, basically about a month ago as a new product, we're keeping it at 30 days, so it's kind of a very current, up-to-date data set. I think as we get more folks onboarded and we have more data under our belt, we'll have quarter-over-quarter metrics. We might have some year-over-year comparisons. So that I think will come over time as we get more folks signed up and more data collected. Last thing I'll point out here is in the drop-down is the comp set. So this is kind of what you can compare yourself against. So for example, if you're a large publisher in the Western United States, you can actually compare yourself against other people who are, or other publishers who are of similar size and geography. So you can see here there's a lot of combinations here. So again, up to from as low as 1 to 5 million pages a month to as high as 25 plus. That's kind of the categories. So that's kind of the filters. So I'll kind of walk through some of these metrics here and maybe highlight ones that I think are interesting. So if I scroll down a bit here, the first thing that I'd really like to show here is the ad blocking percentage. So at the bottom left here, you can see that my sort of composite newspaper website, I'm seeing about 3% of my users block ads, basically. However, I see that my comp set is actually about 5%, which is, I think, about in line with what we've seen from other sources as well that measure ad blocking. About 5% of users on a given website, especially a newspaper website, are blocking ads. Again, if I'm a larger publisher, let me compare myself against that, and I can see how do I compare against the 25 million and up category. I can see I'm still doing pretty well. They're just under 5%, so I'm doing pretty well there. What's remarkable too about this ad block percentage on the user basis is kind of the correlation with the pages that are ad blocked. So you can see here that, for me, those 3% of users are actually generating about 18% of my page views. So that's a pretty significant finding just from looking at a high-level number, is that there's a small but very engaged group of users who are blocking almost 20% of my pages. But again, I know that that's still not necessarily terrible since I'm still under the average across the industry and for publishers that are of my size. So moving on to impressions. So here we'll break down essentially sell-through rates by platform and ad position. You can see here we've got, let me zoom in a little bit, see if I can make this a little bigger. There we go. So for example, by platform, I can see my direct impression and proportion. I'm getting about 63% of my inventory being sold through local channels, about 18% through, or 19% almost through programmatic. I can see that for this comp set, it's actually, I'm doing pretty well in that regard. A significant chunk of the impressions in the industry are coming through programmatic. So this is actually a very, very strong local sales force, or perhaps a strong, my publisher has a strong relationship with our advertisers. You can see as well here on the right some of the proportions of the ad positions. So a billboard would be kind of a large sort of position at the top. Leaderboard is also either at kind of the banner header or at the bottom of the page. Half page as well is kind of usually in the side position, and medium rectangle. These are kind of the top 4 that we've seen that are pretty consistent across publishers. But you can also see that my sell-through rates and my proportion of impressions across tablet, mobile, and so on. So
Arvid?
Yeah.
I apologize. We have a few questions that would like to be asked. The first, what method do you use to determine if a user is using an ad blocker?
Good question. So we use what our developer likes to call a passive ad block detection. And what that means is essentially we're not necessarily getting into the game of trying to, kind of one-up, this kind of cold war between the advertisers, the ad blockers. I know last year there was kind of I remember Facebook kind of started blocking ad blockers. And the next week, they found a way around it. The next week, Facebook found a way around that. So we're kind of not getting to that fight. The way our ad blocking works is, or ad block detection works, is we evaluate for every single person and every page as it's being loaded, our impressions and ad revenue being realized on that page. So if we see in our database that, let's say Sean logs on to the page, he's reading 2-3 pages, and we see no revenue coming in from his activity, then we infer that he must be using some sort of ad blocker. So that's why we don't necessarily break out or be using AdBlock Plus or the other one or some other method. It's really they're actively through some method not realizing revenue or ads, and that's kind of how we infer an ad block.
Okay, thank you. Another couple questions here. Are users defined as per session or per user or multiple sessions?
Users are defined very similar to how Google Analytics defines them. So a user is basically a cookie, a first-party cookie, and it's over essentially a 30-day period. So if the same user comes back to your site, over, let's say today's June 8th, so let's say we saw someone come to your site May 9th, May 10th, and every day up until today, we would treat that user as a single user. Now again, if they refresh their cookies or they change devices or they change browsers, typically like most tracking tools like Omniture and Google, they would set a new cookie, so we would track them a second time because they're anonymous. So I hope that answers that question.
Okay, and last one for this session. Does an ad blocking measurement method come with this tool? And if each publisher uses a different method, how are you able to compare them?
Short answer, yes. That's kind of part of the default data that we provide and collect. In terms of different methods, I maybe touched on that briefly, but it's essentially, again, if someone, because of the way we're collecting the data or we're inferring the ad blocking, again, if someone loads a page and we see no ads come on that page or no revenue being generated on that page for that user, we then can infer that person is using an ad blocker. So again, we actually have, and I'll walk through this in the onboarding, we have tags that go into DFP on the page as well. So essentially we're kind of tagged in both places, and we can figure out what impressions are being delivered to which people. So again, if someone's not seen as impressions, we infer ad blocking. So short answer, if they're using Ghostery or Script Blocker or even AdBlock Plus or some other thing that they're going to come out with at some point, or if they're using the new Chrome browser that's going to be released in a couple months here, we will be able to infer that they're not getting any ads because they're just simply not seeing them.
And I think one other important point is it's the same across everybody, and the same methods being used across the entire universe. So it's the apples to apples comparison.
Correct. That was Matt Lindsay, our president, who good comment. So just to wrap up on advertising, I'll go ahead and skip. So revenue is pretty much the same as impressions, just breaking out the proportions of revenue. Ad yield. Here we have things like CPM. Again, broken down by platform, by size, and so on. So you can see my sort of composite demo newspaper here, about $2.35 eCPM, compared to about $4 on average across the industry. I can see that surprisingly, my programmatic is actually higher than my direct, which is actually kind of surprising. That might be just because I'm a demo client, so that's maybe there's some strange composite things going on there. But you can see on average for the industry, it's about $10 for direct sold impressions on desktop versus about $2.24 for programmatic. And you can see it's pretty similar across mobile and not too different for tablet either. So to move on, let's go to audience just to keep this thing rolling. So here we kind of switch from the ad side over to more kind of the audience analytics. So initially we start with just kind of the basic page views and visitor counts. So again, obviously I'm comparing myself to a fairly kind of average. So if I make this a more similar comp set, we can see what that looks like. There we go. So here I can see that I'm pretty much right on par for my visits per visitor. So again, visits is essentially the same as sessions in Google. So it's kind of counting the number of times a person visits over the course of a month. I'm also breaking down my kind of referral traffic. So we sometimes see some publishers skew heavily to Facebook or to Google. I can see I'm pretty much in line with my comp set here, so nothing too shocking. And then kind of breaking down kind of the source of the traffic and the time spent. So I can see that for the most part, I get about 30% of my visitors are local, which means that they're within my market area. And we use the same kind of technology that Omniture and Google use in terms of figuring out where a person's coming from and what device they're on. I guess the one thing here that's perhaps interesting is me versus my comp set. I'm actually doing pretty well in terms of, or I guess a little bit better in terms of time per visit. So, not dramatically better, but a few seconds better in terms of the visit time. So that's kind of the engagement metrics, traffic sources. This is more of a drill down on the referral donut charts you saw on the prior page. So this is kind of breaking down more detail on the Google refers, the Facebook refers. And we break down, what's the visits per visitor metrics. So again, for me, Google is a little bit less than the comp set. I'm also breaking down the time per visit, and so on. So essentially, it really gives you a really detailed view about where the traffic's coming from. How do I compare in terms of where it's coming from, what the type, what the engagement is of that traffic, and so on. One more point here, just on the refers. We've kind of standardized these across, again, the industry as well, as obviously Facebook and Google are the top two. We do have Twitter and Yahoo and Bing. There might be others that we can add over time if we see there's a shift in behavior of the general public. But for now, we're kind of breaking out those specifically. The main one, though, is usually this typed source, which is essentially someone who comes to your site directly without any kind of search. So that's kind of usually your core audience is using that typed method. And then lastly, on audience, we have some more data on engagement. And this is kind of looking at some metrics that may sound familiar. So bounce rate, I think that actually exists in Google Analytics as well. So we define it the same way, pretty much. It's the proportion of flybys versus all users. And flyby is essentially someone who has exactly one page view and then they leave the site. So that's kind of the rate here. And you can see I'm pretty much in line versus the comp set here, about 71% is the industry average. There's two metrics here that are unique. This is kind of some of the things that we've developed and that are, again, kind of listener data points that are unique to the industry. We have this metric called page depth, and it's essentially looking at how far down the page does the user scroll. So similar to kind of what Chartbeat does in a way, where it kind of looks at heat maps and how people engage on the site. We actually figure out are people actually reading your content, and if so, how far down the page are they getting? So you can see for at least my paper here versus the comp set, people are actually not reading as far down the page as average. And you can see velocity here as well. This is kind of a new metric. This is essentially how fast do they scroll. So we're still trying to find kind of what the sweet spot is here, but at least for the industry, it's about 80 pixels per second. And what that means is they're scrolling at about a pace of, probably about several lines of text per 5 or 10 seconds or so. But I guess they do scroll slower here for my site. And lastly, on engagement, one of our kind of things that we talk about a lot as a key measurement of engagement and success on the audience side is the share of the traffic coming from what we call logged-in users, or sometimes we refer to as known users. So a known user is essentially somebody who is, again, usually a subscriber, a registered user. Perhaps they're opted in for newsletters. So if those people are actively coming to your sites and generating volume and page views, we think that's a measure of success in the industry. So we thought this was an important one to include, and is also, again, kind of standard with our tagging. You can see for me, for this publisher, I'm doing pretty well. About almost 0.5% of my users are from the known audience or from known users, 33,000, which is pretty good. But compared to the comp set, that right now it's about 0.2% is what we see in the industry. So again, those sound very low. They are low, but again, if you saw before the 6.1 million anonymous users, most of those are flybys. So again, it's kind of all in context. It's not as bad as it looks, but I think that's kind of one of the key measures that we'll be tracking over time.
Hey, Arvid, we've got a couple more questions here. First one is, can I build a comp set that excludes publishers in my company? So I'm only looking at peers or competitor benchmarks only.
That's a really good question. I think there might be a way to do that. Right now, the comp set only includes kind of the region and volume settings, but I'll have to take it up with our dev team and see if we can do that easily. If so, then absolutely. If it's a bit more work, we may have to kind of release that feature at a later date. All right. Sounds good. So almost done here. So the last chart here, last page here is this analytics overview, and this is essentially a metric that we've come up with. We call them basically power users, and these are users who are essentially for us kind of the ones who are part of your core audience, your loyal readers, those who are coming to your site frequently. So we essentially measure what is the share of those users who are really, really engaged on your site, and what is the performance of those users on your site as well. So as a kind of a rule of thumb, or kind of as just a quick way to summarize it, essentially the top 20% of your users are typically kind of that core audience. So that's kind of about what we typically see. So here we actually see it's closer to about 30% for my paper here. It's about 33%. Or excuse me, that's the page views. So let's see here. Yeah, so the page views coming from my core readers is actually higher here. So about 70%, 71% of my page views are coming from that core readership. So that's again pretty much in line, or a little bit better than perhaps what we see, versus kind of maybe 2/3 of volume coming from users who are in that kind of loyal power users, so to speak. We can also see some metrics about them. So on average, the power users generate about almost 5 pages per visit. They spend, for me at least, almost 9.5 minutes on site. That's still a bit lower than the average. So on average, it's about 16.5 minutes, or almost 17 minutes for those power users. And lastly, in terms of the time per page, it's again 4 minutes for me versus 3 minutes for, or almost 4 minutes for the ComSet. So just a way to kind of compare that loyal core audience and see how you stack up on that front. So hopefully I went pretty quickly some of those metrics. From here, I'll perhaps pause on the demo and maybe switch maybe 5 minutes on kind of onboarding process, and then we'll kind of get back to some of the kind of final points and wrap up. Actually, while we're, let me switch that up. Let me go back to the onboarding real quick, just since we're already on the site here. So, one of the things that we can actually configure is, kind of that tagging system. So I'll walk briefly through kind of how to set that up. So, if you once you're kind of logged in and authenticated, you'll be able to navigate to this screen. This is kind of an onboarding screen that we've prepared. And I'll just summarize at a high level what this is, and maybe come back to it and walk through the key steps. But essentially, here you'll be able to kind of track your progress as you onboard. And the steps are basically, you need to activate your site in our system. From there, you'll be able to activate your tagging, configure it, deploy it, and then from there we go into data validation, which is where we just check your data, clean it, make sure everything's correct. If we see any issues, we follow up with you. And then essentially once you've passed that validation phase, you're complete, and your data will be here available for you to see, and it'll be in an anonymized form for the tool as well. So that's just a quick overview. I may come back and kind of drill into the onboarding in more detail, but that's kind of the onboarding at about 1 minute. So with this data, I thought I'd, just kind of out of interest for myself and for the group here, I thought I'd share a few interesting things that we just saw as kind of at an aggregate level. So again, because we have this sort of, benchmarking database, we can actually compare and look at just what the industry is doing as a whole and kind of what that spread is across the industry. So I mentioned before, it's about 5% of users are blocking. This might be a little bit older data, so it's at 6%. But essentially about 5 to 6% of users are ad blocking across the industry. You can see the range is actually quite relatively large, I suppose. So from as low as 2%, which you saw was kind of my demo site, to as high as almost 12% of users are ad blocking. Again, those are perhaps some outliers there, above 10%. But in any case, you can kind of see the range that we see across the industry. Similar for CPM or eCPM, you can see it's about $5.60, but again, that ranges from as low as $2 to about $12 or higher. And in terms of engagement, sort of the pages per visitor, we saw about 4.2 is kind of the average, and it ranges as high as almost 9 or 10 pages per visitor. So again, this is kind of the more interesting data we have behind the scenes that we might be able to develop. And the question actually I get, and Michael, you may be able to answer this, is will this kind of data be potentially available or made available by NMA, by Alliance to members?
And absolutely, part of the goal of this project is to, one, build out the peer comparison tools so members can use it in that regard, but it allows us to then take high-level industry trend and report on that. We're looking to push reports out on a quarterly basis so that we continue to have real data that we can speak to and talk about the performance of the industry.
So to wrap up, I think what we'll do is I'll talk a little bit about just listener and some things that we can do. We'll wrap up with Michael, and then since we have about 15 minutes, open up for questions and maybe even spend 2 minutes in a more detailed overview of the onboarding at the very end. So with that, I thought I was going to spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes talking about kind of what else you can do with this data. So obviously it's great for benchmarking, and I think it might reveal a lot of interesting things and trends and kind of how you stack up against peers in the industry. One of the services that we can kind of provide and help publishers with is essentially audience analytics. So at a high level, it's essentially being much more intelligent and precise about how you acquire and engage your users. As a really short example, if you see someone who's an anonymous visitor and their engagement level is sort of medium level engagement, we feel that a way to approach that audience is not necessarily to give them a paid offer right away and try to convert them to a paid subscriber. We see a lot of people just essentially reject that and leave the site. So the approach that we would perhaps recommend with this data and these audience analytics is to say, let's take the people who are moderately engaged, not quite as engaged as some others, and let's sign them up for newsletters, let's register them, and essentially let's turn them into a known user so you can target them with email subscriptions, offers via email and paid offers after the fact. So in contrast, if someone is highly engaged, then you should probably be much more aggressive with their conversion strategies. So it's more that's where perhaps you take offer a paid product and maybe discount a little bit. But again, just the way that we can use this data to grow and really engage your audience. On the ad side, we've developed one of the things that we've heard a lot about is just kind of visibility into what's happening behind the scenes of all the ad networks and ad stacks. So we can essentially prepare a much more detailed dashboard outlining what's your share of revenue from DFP versus different advertisers or different ad networks, and really drill down into what is the value and volume and performance of these different ad systems. So essentially that's kind of one more thing that we can do with this data on top of benchmarking. And lastly, for the newsroom or for the content side, it's essentially finding a way to create or essentially educating or informing the editorial folks of how they can optimize their content creation to meet the goals of audience or advertising. So an example here, we can actually show you that sports content and the articles underneath sports generated, in this example, $150,000 in ad revenue. We can also show you that they generated 12 new starts directly, and that sports content was read 147 times prior to people converting. So essentially kind of correlating or bringing together the newsroom with kind of what is the value and ROI from an audience and from an advertising perspective. Here again, we're looking at top-level sections, but you're able to drill down into subsections or individual articles or even authors, as well as kind of where the content came from. So it's just a way for the newsroom to leverage this data and kind of inform how they allocate resources in terms of what content they publish more of or less of and when they publish it. So back to Metrics Exchange, I guess I might turn to Michael to kind of offer some final comments and questions. And again, if there's time, we can kind of go into a more detailed onboarding demo as well.
Sure. At the top line, obviously our members and those of you that are on the call who are interested in coming on board with the Metrics Exchange benchmarking platform, it's as simple as shooting me an email. And if you haven't already, set up your Alliance username and password to log on to our regular newsmediaalliance.org site. You'll need to do that first. And then once that's done, I'll be reaching out to you to get a profile of who you'd like in terms of access to the system and which of your sites, if not all, to include in the onboarding. And then once that process is done, you'll be able to log on to the nma.mathereconomics.com site and start placing the tags. That's if you don't already have Listener deployed. If you do already have Listener deployed, it's a much simpler process, which is just us setting up access for your accounts. And then we let the folks at Mather know, and we'll be can push data directly into the dashboard. Second to that, if you're not an Alliance member, the folks at Mather, being Bob and Sean is on the call with us right now, can assist you in using the dashboards as well for a nominal fee. Again, reminding you that as an Alliance member, this is included with your membership, so it's a tool to help you do better or measure yourself against your peers better and increase your digital business effort.
Great, thank you. So Arvid, we have some questions here that I was hoping maybe we could get to if you have a minute before we go into any more details on the onboarding. Is that okay?
Yes, let's do that. Yep.
All right, very good. So can you explain a little bit more about how the advertising performance is captured, calculated, and measured?
Sure. So on the dashboard or on the benchmarking, we're looking at essentially three items. We're looking at yield, which is effectively CPM and click-through rates, looking at impression volume, and breaking it down by platform and ad position, and also advertising revenue by platform and ad position. And also all three of those things are break down by the ad types. In other words, is it programmatic or direct? So that's kind of the metrics that we're looking at. And the performance, when we say performance, we mean those essentially three aspects and the breakout by platform, position, and by type. The way they're collected, and this may also be apparent in the onboarding here as we walk through it later in a second here, we deploy tags on the website, and we also deploy tags in DFP, typically in a creative wrapper. If you have DFP Professional, if not, it's basically one tag that lives on the page. And essentially, that tag is integrated into the ad server. So that's essentially how we actually collect the data. Is we collect the data, we collect each ad impression that's being served up and deliver it on every page and to every user. And based on that, we evaluate, again, all the above: CPM, ad blocking, yield, and so on.
And is that for both direct and indirect?
Yes. Yes. So when I say programmatic, I mean indirect. So yes, programmatic.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. Yep.
And
any other questions? Go ahead.
yes, I was into that question. Another question is, do you break out uniques versus sessions or impressions? We
do. Yeah. One of the we do have the. Let me see if I can go back here real quick. We have we call them users, but that's essentially uniques. We have the sessions, we call them visitors, or sorry, we call them visits, which is the same thing. And impressions we have as well. So all three of those are accounted for in the dashboard in some form.
Okay, very good. Thank you.
So with that, I know we have about 4 minutes till we wrap up here. So let's go ahead and do this onboarding demo. This is for the folks who, were just, I know there's a lot of people just waiting for the technical explanation, so we'll make this good. So if you're logging in for the first time, you'll be redirected to this LTM page here. And there's a few things here I'll point out. Again, you're going to have your list of papers here. So again, if you're Gannett, you'll have all 110 sites here for you to configure. You'll be able to see your status in the timeline here at any point in time, so you can see where you are. Typically, your interaction will be here to the right, where you can advance to the next step, the tagging configuration, which will appear here in a second. So again, if you're first time accessing the site and onboarding, all you got to do is click Activate. And what that does, essentially, it sends myself and our team here an email that says, if you want to start onboarding. You'll see in the timeline here, you move from not active to activate. And then it's usually within not more than 24 hours, you should be able to log back in here, and you should see this next step. So we've essentially now set you up, and you can go into this tagging and generate your tags. So this is the tag. As I mentioned before, this is asynchronous, again, very lightweight. You can put it in Tag Manager, Google Tag Manager. You can put it in the header, the footer, wherever. And this will essentially pick up all the key metrics we talked about. It will pick up the ad metrics as well. And essentially, you put that into your site. And once that's on your site, you can then move on to configuration. As an example, if you're using DFP Professional, let me reload this real quick. You'll see two tags. So you'll see the kind of the website tag, and you also see there we go. That's for small business. Well, in any case, if you're using DFP, you'll also see this tag as well. So the scripts here collectively will capture everything we need, and we have more detailed instructions about where to put this for the DFP installation. That's essentially the step. So once those tags are in place on your site, you can click the next step, which is configuration. And from there, you'll see this thing update. You'll see you're now in the fourth step, and you can now configure your site. So you can click that, click OK, and you have all these options to configure. Now, and this may look like a lot. You don't have to configure every one of these. It's really whatever you feel is important for us to know. One thing that I'd suggest is the user ID. This is essentially that login piece that that logged in users or known users metric that I talked about. So what you can do here is essentially click each of these parameters or data points, select where it's coming from. So if it's coming from your data layer, or if it's coming from meta tag, or something that's completely new, you can define your own data source and save that, and that will configure everything as needed. So once you've done that, you essentially click the deploy button, deploy it. It'll ask you if you want to do it, say OK. And then what's happening behind the scenes is the tag that you've installed that you saw me show you earlier on your site, that tag is now looking up against this configuration setting in Lucerne Tag Manager. From there, you're essentially in data validation. You can see it's grayed out here, so you can't actually move to the next step until myself, our developer, our team looks at the data coming in, evaluates it, makes sure it's clean, ready, and so on. You can see you'll be stuck here for maybe a few days, hopefully not much more than that. But once you've passed, let's say you got a clean bill of health, all is great, you'll move on to the next stage, which is basically stabilization and complete. So stabilization, essentially, once we validate data is all good, it's about 30 days until you start seeing data coming in. And once you've hit that 30-day mark, then you're basically complete. And throughout this whole process, we will update you. So you'll get a lot of kind of emails from us telling you you're in the next step, or if we see an issue, we'll notify you. But effectively, that's the onboarding process in about 4 minutes. As always, you'll see documentation here that outlines this whole process in excruciating detail, so you have that as well. So that's all I had, Sean and Michael, and any other questions or anything else, I defer back to you.
Okay, thank you. And due to the time and the number of questions that we had today, we're going to have to get back to everybody directly with some of the questions. So I apologize for that, but as soon as we're done, we'll get on the questions and get back to each of you. I'd like to thank Michael and Arvid for your time today, and for everybody in attendance. We really appreciate it. If you do have additional questions, please email those to webinars@mathereconomics.com. And as I said at the beginning of our webinar, a copy of the slide deck and recording will be mailed to everybody that registered. So we appreciate your time today again. Thank you and have a great afternoon.